Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the walls. Literally. You're in Paris, but not the romantic postcard version. It's the 1600s. The air smells vaguely of bread, soot, and chamber pots, and you've just stepped into a creaky old townhouse. The floorboards groan under your feet like they're tattling on you. The candle you're holding flickers, casting nervous shadows against the cracked plaster. But then, did the wall just move? Not a full jiggle, mind you. Just the tiniest rustle, as if the building itself let out a sigh. You lean in, press your ear to the surface. There's a faint shuffle, a cough, and... is that someone whispering? Yep. There's a person in there, living, breathing, probably just trying to get some sleep like you. Welcome to the time when some Parisians, especially the poor, the overlooked, the creative, and the desperate, made their homes inside the walls of Parisian buildings. You probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our sleepy little map grow. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself navigating a narrow hallway of a once grand building, now slightly wilted at the corners. Paris in the 1600s isn't so much a city as it is a patchwork of streets stitched together by grime, gossip, and overlapping lives. The houses are tall, haphazard, and packed tight like teeth in a tired mouth. And these aren't just homes. These are ecosystems. Between the beams, behind the hearths, tucked beneath stairwells, people live here, not metaphorically. They're literally in the walls. You step gingerly past a broom leaning suspiciously against what looks like a panel. There's no handle hole, no hinges, but there's a smudge, just enough to suggest it's opened before. You nudge it, and there, squeezed between the outer wall and the parlor plaster, is a niche, a sleeping mat, a box of combs, a crust of bread, a human presence in a pocket of space you weren't supposed to notice. Historians still argue whether this type of habitation was survival ingenuity or exploitation on a grand urban scale. Some call it squatting. Others argue it was more like extreme renting, under the table, over the ceiling, and never, ever listed. Your feet crunch over some crumbs as you step into what looks like a closet but smells oddly lived in. Paris's population had boomed by the 1600s, surging past 400,000. That's a lot of people wanting to be close to the center, near the work, the water, the gossip, the pastries. But space was a luxury, so people made do. And you do too, following the creaking joists upward, where you discover a hunchbacked man sleeping with a pillow against a rafter and a candle stub stuck into a clay lump on the beam. He opens one eye. Close the trap door when you leave, yeah? You're not sure if you were invited in, or if you've stumbled through time into someone's rented ribcage. These structures, the tall, timber-framed buildings lining the Seine, weren't exactly built with modern zoning laws in mind. Gaps between walls, hollow floor cavities, and false fronts all became fair game for the creatively housed. A surprising number of these spots were deliberately designed with little hidey holes for storage, servant passageways, or insulation. But what was meant to store firewood often ended up sheltering a person. The Crown knew about it too. There are records of municipal inspectors discovering up to 10 unregistered residents in a single upper-level attic crawl. And these folks weren't always squatters. Some were employees, too lowly to merit a real room, but too necessary to be turned out. Others were displaced artisans, struggling actors, widows with nowhere else to go. One aristocrat reportedly kept his elderly sister-in-law tucked behind the nursery. She was too loud for the drawing room but too sickly for the street, kind of a family heirloom with a cough. You trail your fingers along a cracked wall and feel warmth. Someone's cooking on the other side, slowly, cautiously. A stew of onions, maybe turnips. It's oddly cozy, but your candle's getting low, and the air is thick with history and lint. A mainstream fact: Paris in the 1600s was undergoing massive social and architectural change. The medieval city was being swallowed by a modernizing monarchy. Big stone buildings were being added. Plaster was cheap, walls thinner. Suddenly, space was both abundant and illusory. For every glamorous new salon, there was someone nibbling a stolen apple 2 feet to the left, just past the wainscoting. Fringe tidbit? Some people trained rats to bring them bits of food from the kitchens below. The rats, apparently, could squeeze through brickwork better than most toddlers. There's even a half-documented case of a man who allegedly lived for 3 years in the space behind a church organ, moving only when music played to cover the creaks of his body shifting on the beams. Did he believe he was invisible? Maybe. Did he claim he could smell sin through the pipe vents? Also, yes. And as for that creaky townhouse you entered at the start, yeah, there were probably 4 people inside the walls at any given moment. They weren't ghosts. They were simply surviving. The floor groans again. Another whisper. Another life you'll never see fully, but feel all around. The walls are whispering again. You keep walking, carefully now, through this spongy city of overlapping bodies and secret breath. Outside, the cobbled streets of Paris chatter with carts and clogs and vendors hawking pears of questionable softness. But inside these buildings, something quieter unfolds. Let's talk about how Paris got so crowded that people started nesting between walls like clever raccoons with rent. It's the early 1600s, and Paris is on a bit of a growth spurt. The city, still hemmed in by its medieval walls, is trying desperately to hold more people than it was ever designed to. The result? Every possible inch of space gets reimagined as shelter. Ceilings get lowered. Rooms get sliced in half like a baguette. And the walls, those thick timber and lath barriers that once just held heat, suddenly become something more: habitable real estate. You duck under a low beam. It smells of old wool, damp wood, and whatever century-old disappointment is clinging to the plaster. There's a tiny ladder, a glorified stick with notches, and above it, the murmur of someone humming off-key. A woman is drying herbs above a false ceiling, her hands moving deftly, as if the risk of eviction or asphyxiation doesn't really bother her. People are inventive. People are also tired. And when a city groans under the weight of its own success, the walls get a little porous. Mainstream historians will tell you that by mid-century, Paris was among the densest cities in Europe. Rents were skyrocketing. Official lodging regulations existed, but enforcement was spotty at best. And so, the working class got creative, squeezing into lofts, stables, cellars, and yes, in-between spaces where no human being was ever technically meant to live. You crouch now behind a tall wardrobe where someone has scratched a hole through the paneling to peek into the adjacent room. It's a servant's eye view, both literally and socially. Through that tiny circle, she can observe when it's safe to emerge for chores, or maybe even sneak a nap when the mistress goes out for her morning promenade. Here's a fringe tidbit. One 17th century building on the Rue du Temple had over 70 listed occupants, and 5 unlisted ones who were only discovered when a wall collapsed during a thunderstorm. One man was found sleeping in a cavity barely 2 feet wide, with a spoon tied to his belt and a loaf of bread fashioned into a pillow. He apparently resumed sleeping the moment the rain ceased, according to the baffled city inspector. You sidestep into an alcove beneath a staircase where someone's tacked up pages from a religious tract. The Latin is sloppy, the ink faded, but it's a wall dweller's version of decor. Faith, wallpaper, or both. The candle sputters slightly, and the shadows leap like dancers. Historians still argue whether this architectural behavior, building and living into cavities, was an act of protest, desperation, or simple practicality. Was this urban ingenuity or silent resistance against an indifferent elite? The records don't say, but the worn handholds and soot-blackened crawlways say plenty. The bones of Paris weren't built to be still. Between the slanted roofs and sagging beams, people slipped in like ivy. They were tolerated, sometimes pitied, often ignored. The walls didn't mind. The city kept growing, and so did the spaces between. A sudden draft kisses your neck. You turn to see a gap in the wall, no bigger than a cat. And just for a moment, a small hand reaches through. It plucks an apple from a shelf and vanishes. Not a ghost, just a hungry child who's figured out how to live between margins. A reality check here. Even the well-off weren't immune to the wall squeeze. Aristocrats with declining fortunes sometimes rented out parts of their homes to quiet boarders who would not be seen, but may be heard if spoken to, as one bizarre contract read. Imagine paying rent to be an echo. This was the era of the Hotel Particulier, large private residences for the rich, which often included dozens of servants, extended family, and business dealings all under one ornate roof. But as fortunes fluctuated, some homeowners quietly let parts of their homes go to people who would promise not to breathe too loud. You run your fingers along the edge of a decorative cornice and discover that it swings outward, revealing a child's hiding spot lined with straw and 3 wooden buttons. Someone once lived here. Maybe someone still does. The buildings lean inward, not from poor construction, but from the weight of too many lives nudging against the same spine. Paris, in the 1600s, was a city where housing and hiding blurred together. And yes, there were incidents. Fires started when wall dwellers knocked over candles or tried to cook inside compartments barely big enough for a soup pot. Entire buildings burned down, and yet, the practice persisted, because where else could people go? Your feet slide on a waxy patch of floor, possibly from a spilled candle, possibly from old soup. You hear giggling, a childish snort, and look up. A face peers through a hole in the ceiling, missing a few teeth and grinning like a mischievous gargoyle. "Watch your head," the voice calls. Sometimes things fall from upstairs. Lovely. There's something oddly comforting about this layered way of living. In a world where space was currency, the walls were the piggy banks, the last quiet place where the poor could squirrel themselves away. You pause beside a vent in the plaster, feeling the warmth of another candle behind it, maybe even someone's quiet breath. Paris is full of lives like this, soft, hidden, undetected, stitched between beams and beneath your boots. In the 1600s, no square foot went unoccupied for long, and that includes the walls. You've lost track of how many walls you've passed through now, some hollow, some stuffed with old rags, some suspiciously warm. But this one is different. It smells like talc and stale wine, with just a hint of singed wig powder. You crawl carefully into the cavity of what was once a grand home. The air's thick, close, but soft, like the inside of someone's overcoat. And then you hear it. the tap-tap swish of fine silk skirts on the other side of the wall. A servant lives here, not in the servants' quarters. That would be too easy. No, she lives in the wall, between the dressing room and the main salon, behind a panel so skillfully carved you'd never know it was hollow. Her world is narrow. She rises before dawn, her fingers already numbed from cold stone and close air, and presses her ear against the panel to hear if Madame is awake. If not, she waits. There is no space to pace. She just sits, silent, folded in on herself like a shawl. Once she hears stirring, she'll quietly open a seam in the wall, glide into the room, light the fire, air the linens, and melt back into her niche like a ghost. If she does her job right, she's invisible. If she's seen, she's reprimanded. And still, it's better than the street. In 17th century Paris, being a domestic servant meant existing in the shadows, quite literally. Wealthy households didn't just want labor, they wanted silence, invisibility, and obedience. Servants entered through back doors, used separate staircases, and were often housed in closets, cupboards, and, in more than a few cases, cavities built between rooms. The wall servant wasn't officially a thing, of course. You won't find it in any employment ledger. But her presence is unmistakable in the whispered stories of upper-class diaries, and in the suspiciously well-swept corners of rooms no one was supposed to clean. Mainstream fact time. Many aristocratic homes in Paris featured small hidden corridors known as dégagements, used to allow staff to move about unnoticed. But these were usually narrow passageways. What happened in homes too small or too old for such amenities? They improvised. Walls, false panels, ceiling cavities, they became secret infrastructure for the help. You shift, knees creaking, and spot a peephole, carefully drilled, lined with black cloth to prevent reflections. From here, the servant watches her mistress entertain. She memorizes gestures, anticipates needs. Her world is a theater, and she's the backstage crew, forever out of sight. A fringe tidbit. Some maids reportedly made little games out of their spying. One would place bets with herself about which guest would faint from their corset first. Another kept tallies of who stole sugar cubes from the bowl when they thought no one was looking. Your fingers brush over a faint carving on the wood. Je suis ici. I am here. A tiny assertion of presence in a life meant to disappear. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were formalized or purely desperate. Some believe certain families intentionally created servant niches in renovations. Others argue these were makeshift shelters claimed out of necessity, then begrudgingly tolerated. You crawl deeper. There's a sliver of light from a crack in the wall. Through it, you glimpse the full absurdity of Parisian upper-class rituals. A powdered wig being fluffed with duck feathers. A poodle in a satin bonnet licking gravy from a silver spoon. And not 5 inches away, a maid huddled on a pile of rags, rubbing her hands to keep them from cramping. She hasn't been outside in 3 days. A mouse runs across your hand. You don't scream. You've accepted your fate. In these wall spaces, lives unfolded in secret. Letters were written and hidden in knots of wood. Small trinkets, combs, rosaries, dried flowers were tucked into crevices. These weren't just shelters. They were micro-homes, built entirely around silence and submission. And not everyone was kind to these shadow dwellers. Some mistresses saw them as little more than animated tools. If they made noise, they were slapped. If they overslept, they were locked in. One account tells of a maid who accidentally sneezed during a dinner party and was promptly dismissed for invading polite society with her lungs. But others grew strangely fond of their silent attendants. A few noble women left small gifts wedged in the walls, an old shawl, a piece of chocolate, a copy of La Fontaine's Fables. One even learned her maid's name. Imagine that. You settle beside a tiny alcove carved into the plaster, what looks like a miniature bookshelf. 4 books sit there, carefully stacked. A prayer book, a broken-spined almanac, a tattered herbal guide, and oddly enough, a slim volume of scandalous poetry with dog-eared corners. Proof, perhaps, that even wall-dwellers liked a little drama. These servants had to be incredibly attuned. They learned to measure time by the creak of floors, to tell moods by perfume trails, to read entire conversations by the temperature of a room. One wall-maid allegedly knew her mistress was having an affair before the husband did, just by the rhythm of footsteps and how long the evening bath took. And still, no one asked her what she thought. No one ever did. You breathe in the musty air, thick with old perfume and soot. It's quiet here, quiet in that way that hums. You press your ear to the wall again, the scratching of a quill. Someone writing a letter, perhaps, maybe confessing, maybe just recording. And somewhere behind you, a soft thump. Someone returning home, to the space between. You duck slightly as you move forward. There's barely space to stand upright now. The ceiling presses low, and the timber beams creak with the kind of aching groan that says they've been holding up the dreams and laundry of at least 7 families for the past 100 years. You've made your way upward, to the roofline of this living, breathing Parisian beehive. Up here, in the strange no-man's land of chimneys, pigeon coops, and half-forgotten staircases, a whole different class of wall-dweller thrives. They're the ones who've claimed Paris's spongy rooftops and hollow chimney flues as unofficial living quarters. Urban stowaways floating just above the gaze of the city below. You peer through a soot-streaked slat and spot her. A woman stirring something in a dented pot over the glowing mouth of a chimney vent. It smells oddly inviting. Maybe onion, maybe old cabbage. Her movements are calm, practiced. She's done this before. Historians still argue whether rooftop chimney dwellers were tolerated by the building owners or just ignored out of convenience. Some accounts suggest there was a kind of mutual silence. Don't burn the place down, and we won't come checking. She sits back, resting on a crate marked for apples, but clearly never used for fruit. Her space is maybe 4 feet wide and just tall enough for her to sit upright, the sloped roof curling around her like a shawl. It's cold up here, but she's layered in wool and newspaper, probably printed 3 months ago and still more current than her landlord's attention. A mainstream fact, in the 17th century, many Parisian rooftops weren't sealed off or patrolled. Building codes were vague and enforcement nearly non-existent. The city simply hadn't grown upward, with the same control as it had outward, and so these forgotten rooftop levels, attics, open crawlways, chimney junctions, became havens for the quietly unhoused. As the lower city got crowded, the upper spaces became more than just storage. They became survival. And then there were the pigeons. Oh yes. Parisian rooftop dwellers often kept pigeons, not for pets, but for messages, meat, and in one lovingly embellished tale, racing. One man, known only as Jules the Quiet, allegedly trained a fleet of rooftop pigeons to deliver tiny folded poems across the city. No one ever caught him, and no one ever proved it was him. But a few of those pigeon-sized sonnets were discovered, decades later, behind the bricks of a collapsed chimney. Your eyes scan the roofline, where you spot the unmistakable silhouette of another figure. Young, male, wiry, possibly 14, possibly 30. He's stringing a line between 2 beams, and from it hang socks, pouches of herbs, and what might be a small carved doll. Every rooftop is its own tiny village, complete with rituals, relationships, and territorial lines. A fringe tidbit: chimney sweeps, especially young ones, sometimes slept inside the chimneys they cleaned, curled in ash and soot like urban bats. It was warm, in a perverse way, and some reportedly developed a sixth sense for smoke changes. One even claimed he could predict a thunderstorm by how the soot settled overnight. You crouch low to avoid a gust of smoke that leaks sideways from a nearby flue. The warm air fogs your vision, and for a moment it feels like the whole rooftop is exhaling. Tired, resigned, quietly alive. There's movement to your left, a flap of linen, then a face. An elderly man, eyes like marbles, lifts a curtain of patched fabric. He nods once, offers you a peeled chestnut. You accept it. It's surprisingly sweet. These rooftop folk aren't squatters in the conventional sense. They're more like ghosts with chores, people who keep the chimneys clean, the vents unclogged, the flues from exploding, all while asking very little in return. Occasionally, they barter with kitchen maids, lowering baskets by string in exchange for bread crusts or coffee dregs. One servant wrote in her diary about the man above the ceiling, who left her tiny carved animals each week in a pigeon's nest in exchange for eggshells and biscuit ends. And while these relationships weren't official, they were undeniably part of the ecosystem. Like lichen on a rock, these residents belonged, quietly, patiently, permanently. You shift your weight and hear a soft clatter, a spoon knocked over perhaps. The woman with the cabbage stew shoots you a warning look, then smiles. She pulls a battered book from under her mat and begins to read aloud, softly. It's a story about a knight, or maybe a tax clerk. Honestly, the lines are blurry. Another figure shuffles along a ridge beam, this one with a string of onions looped like pearls over one shoulder. He's humming, out of tune, gloriously unaware that the song he's mumbling was banned at court for being politically suggestive. Up here, politics are more about which chimney you've claimed. Historians sometimes overlook these wall-top lives. They don't leave behind grand letters or revolutionary manifestos. But their footprints are in the dust, their makeshift hooks still hammered into rafters, their initials scratched into beams. And sometimes, just sometimes, an entire cache of their belongings is found decades later, sealed inside a forgotten rooftop cavity. A box with a button, a coin, a lock of hair, and a note. I lived here. Don't be afraid. You lie back on a warm patch of slate and listen to the city breathing below. Church bells, street cries, a violin out of tune. Then silence, punctuated by the soft whistle of someone boiling water above a vent. You're not sure who owns this building. You're not sure the building itself remembers. But here, between the air and the ash, people have carved lives out of nothing. They have watched the city unfold through roof gaps and flue holes and written their stories on smoke. And somehow, in all this height, you've never felt closer to the heart of Paris. You descend again, not quite back to the street, but into a new layer of the city's skin. The cobbles hum distantly beneath your feet, muffled by floorboards, dust, and an impressive network of mouse tunnels. You're standing now in the bones of an old Hotel Particulier, a grand Parisian townhouse that once hosted powdered nobles and politely suppressed political arguments over duck pâté. But you're not in the ballroom. You're behind it, between it, under it. Here in the long-forgotten crawl spaces and servant ducts, lives flicker like candlelight behind a cracked window pane. This is the hidden world of the wall servants, not just squeezed into ceilings or lurking behind fireplaces, but built right into the literal blueprint of high society. You inch sideways along a narrow corridor. The air tastes of ash and lavender, as if a century of spilled perfume and scorched soup has settled into the very plaster. Your fingers trail along a strip of worn molding, and suddenly, your hand disappears through what looks like solid wall. It's a door, but only if you know how to lean on it. Inside is a person. He doesn't flinch, just nods once, and continues brushing dust from a waistcoat that's either vintage or just very, very tired. This man is a domestic retainer, a butler maybe, or what used to be one. He's lived in the walls of this house for so long he no longer uses stairs. He knows every groan in the wood, every rhythm of the household, and, if pressed, he could probably recite the weekly wine order from memory. His room is barely 5 feet across, tucked between two massive bookshelves, and warmed by a thin vent that leaks kitchen air. A tiny oil lamp burns beside a stack of slippers, all identical. All left behind by forgetful guests. Mainstream fact: the layout of 17th century Parisian mansions often included narrow servant corridors and mezzanines, but in some cases, especially during renovations, entire servant paths were sealed off and forgotten, while the servants were still using them. Over time, those who knew the paths simply stayed in them, like ants navigating through hollow sugar sculptures. You crouch and follow a narrowing passage where voices echo through vent grates. Court gossip, political rumors, a surprisingly heated debate about whether pears or apples make a finer tart. The hidden staff here have lived so long in the margins that they've built routines around invisibility. They tap once on the wall to signal a delivery, twice to warn someone is coming. 3 times means someone dropped something important, like a watch or a name. A fringe tidbit: one hotel particulier on Rue Saint-Antoine had a whisper wall, a hollow beam used by the cooks and maids to share gossip between floors without being seen. According to one unreliable but delightful memoir, this led to a 5-year affair between a cellar boy and a scullery maid who never actually saw each other's faces until the week they eloped. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were acts of architectural neglect or deliberate design. Some argue the nobility wanted the walls populated, quiet staff always within reach. Others suggest the homes simply grew too fast, too chaotically, and the help found ways to fit into the leftover spaces. You press your ear to a panel and hear humming, soft, off-key, a lullaby in an unfamiliar dialect. You slide the panel open and find a small alcove where an elderly woman sits on a stool, surrounded by baskets of thread. She nods toward a tapestry on the wall. She's been repairing it for 17 years. "No one remembers I'm here," she says with a shrug. "But someone keeps leaving me needles." The nobility above have no idea their home still breathes. They imagine themselves alone in grand rooms, their voices echoing through marbled halls. But the walls know better. Every whispered confession, every secret rendezvous, every clink of an illicit wine bottle, it all passes through ears that don't technically exist. And while not every hotel particulier had these living shadows, enough did to leave behind stories etched into the bones of the city. A creaking panel gives way beneath your foot, and suddenly you're in a linen cubby no wider than a wardrobe. It smells of starch and lemon balm. You blink. A cat stares at you from the corner, clearly unimpressed. Next to the cat is a woman, possibly in her 20s, curled up with a book of psalms and what appears to be a half-knitted sock. She gestures to the wall. "It's warmer by the drain pipe," she murmurs, and returns to her knitting. You wonder how long she's been here. A week? A year? A decade? Nobody really knows how many people lived this way. Ghosts folded into the structures of wealth and oblivion. There are no census records, no leases, only stories. And sometimes, when a house is renovated, they find the remains, carefully folded linens, initials scratched into beams, and once, a diary hidden in the hollow between two fireplaces. It began with, "This is not a confession, it is a map." You look around at the silent beams and the flickering lamplight. You understand. These people weren't just workers. They were part of the house, its memory, its nervous system. And as you step lightly down another hidden staircase, the plaster sighs behind you, like it remembers every footstep you've taken. Your foot squishes slightly as you step down. It's best not to ask what into. You're somewhere behind a butcher shop now, Rue de la Ferronnerie maybe, or one of its smellier cousins. The stink is unmistakable. Iron, tallow, sawdust, and the vague regret of livestock that took a wrong turn into history. You're not in the butcher's storefront, though. You're behind the wall of it, wedged between brick and timber, staring into the dim outlines of another person's life. He's young, this one, maybe 15. A tanner's apprentice, judging by the small pile of dried leather scraps and the sad excuse for a satchel stitched together from cast-offs. He sleeps here, back wedged against a beam, head tucked beneath a slanted support post. There's barely room to stretch. It's like someone tried to build a drawer and forgot to put anything useful in it, except, of course, a whole human boy. This is his home. This sliver of space, probably half scooped out by a former rat or overly enthusiastic carpenter, now serves as both bedroom and locker. He stashes his boots on a hook hammered into the plaster. Only one boot is currently accounted for. His bread crusts in a pouch strung from a nail, and his sense of safety, well, wherever he can find it. You crouch lower, the wood pressing cold against your back, and watch him roll over in his sleep. His fingers twitch like he's dreaming of something. Possibly escape, possibly soup. Mainstream fact. In the mid-1600s, Paris had an influx of laborers and apprentices from the provinces. These young workers, many of them boys from rural villages, flooded into the city looking for training, wages, and the vague glamour of urban life. What they found instead were overstuffed workshops, 6-day work weeks, and sleeping conditions that wouldn't suit a broom. And yet, they came, in droves. The apprentice's wall was likely never meant for habitation. It might have been a structural cavity, an access point for old plumbing, or simply a pocket of space someone realized was just big enough to tuck a human body. And when you're working 12 hours a day with meat scraps and chemical vats, you'll take what you can get, especially if it's free. Fringe tidbit. There are scattered records of apprentices who lived behind ovens, not beside them, behind them. These tiny spaces carved out between kitchens and shop fronts were hot, dirty, and potentially flammable, but considered cozy by boys who'd grown up sharing barns with sheep. Your current wall-mate, however, has made his space homey in its own way. There's a crude sketch scratched into the timber, 2 people holding what might be baguettes or possibly swords. A tiny carving of a cat sits on the ledge above him, next to a folded piece of parchment with a single word written on it. Demain. Tomorrow. Historians still argue whether these wall dwellings were officially condoned by tradesmen or merely overlooked. Guildmasters often turned a blind eye to where apprentices slept, so long as they showed up on time and didn't die too often. Some masters offered attic pallets, others nothing at all. And so, walls it was. You shift slightly, and something crunches beneath your knee. A wooden spoon. Probably lost or stolen. Maybe both. The apprentice stirs again and opens one eye, glazed with sleep but already calculating. He sees you, nods, goes back to sleep. This is his normal. In the world of 17th century trades, hierarchy ruled. Apprentices were at the bottom, expected to scrub floors, fetch water, trim hides, and somehow still learn a skill through osmosis and exhaustion. Sleeping arrangements were not part of the training package. Many lived where they worked. If the shop was crowded, or the master stingy, they found space between. Some apprentices shared wall cavities, others rotated like a sleeping roster. 2 boys, 1 wall, a practice not unlike hot desking, but with more splinters. And the rats? Oh yes, let's talk about the rats. In Paris, rats weren't just nuisances, they were rivals. They chewed through boots, spoiled bread, and, according to one horrifying anecdote, dragged off a sleeping apprentice's ear. This boy seems luckier. He has a small ring of ash scattered near his bedding, and a few cloves dangling from a string. Old folk remedy for keeping vermin away, or maybe it just smells too weird to bother with. You lean against the inside of the wall, and your shoulder finds a soft spot. Another cavity. You peer through. A second apprentice, curled into a tighter nook. This one has made a little curtain out of stained muslin and holds a sliver of mirror up to his face. He blinks, checks for beard growth, none yet, and mutters something about not dying in this hole. A noble goal. Back in your first nook, the tanner's apprentice stirs and begins his morning ritual, if you can call quietly gnawing stale bread a ritual. He chews thoughtfully, tears off a bit, and tosses it toward a small hole in the corner. A rat appears, pauses, nods, takes the offering. You try not to read too much into that. He pulls out a threadbare tunic and starts dressing, knees cracking, joints stiff. He'll slip out soon through a side panel that opens behind the butcher's grease trap. He times it carefully, only after the master's gone to haggle over ox liver prices. Then he'll trudge to work, hair damp from condensation, eyes dull but awake. Because that's the thing about living in the wall. You're always awake, even when you're sleeping. You slide backward, giving him space, and find yourself once more in the breath of the building, where heat rises through hidden channels, and footsteps from the floor above sound like distant thunder. This is Paris's other economy, not coins and contracts, but borrowed warmth and invisible boundaries. The people who live here don't leave records, they leave scuff marks, scratched initials, small echoes that linger long after they've gone. You find a message etched above the boy's sleeping spot. Ne dis rien. Say nothing. Don't worry, you whisper. Your secret's safe. You've begun to notice a pattern. Wherever there's a wall, there's a whisper. Wherever there's a whisper, someone probably lives behind it. But now, as you shift sideways through the warm belly of yet another building, this one a 3-story merchant's house with impressively uneven floorboards, you begin to hear something different. Coins. Not many. Just a few. A faint clink, a muted shuffle, and a breathy argument over the value of a half-used candle stub. You've entered the informal economy of the wall dwellers, what you might call, with a wink and a heavy sigh, the great Parisian cavity economy. There are no shops here, no signs or receipts, just holes in floorboards, bundles of cloth tied to string, and a whispered system of bartering that exists entirely in the margins of the legitimate world. You pass a slanted beam and duck into a low crawlspace. A woman, late 30s, wiry, with a face like a clever crow, sits behind a slatted wooden screen, surrounded by what looks like the contents of a very specific kind of junk drawer. Buttons, pins, old combs, tiny jars of dried herbs, and exactly 3.5 candles. She's a wall vendor, not licensed, of course, but known, trusted, a supplier of odds, ends, and information. She raises an eyebrow at you. Need a ribbon? Or something to forget with? You politely decline the ribbon. And the forgetting. This is the economy of people who rent space that isn't supposed to exist and trade items that technically never did. Everything has a price, especially silence. Mainstream fact. By the mid-17th century, Paris had entire sub-economies functioning under and alongside the formal ones. Black market rentals were common, particularly in overpopulated neighborhoods like the Marais and Saint-Antoine. Some were merely overpriced storage spaces. Others, unofficial rooms for rent inside crawl spaces and unfinished lofts. Still others, wall-lets. Yes, that's not a typo. Wall-lets. In wealthier buildings, some landlords, or opportunistic tenants, began renting out wall cavities. Not openly, of course, but quietly, discreetly, often for storage that somehow always involved a person with a blanket and a bread crust. Fringe tidbit. One enterprising widow reportedly built a double wall in her kitchen and rented the space to 2 traveling milliners who worked by candlelight through a slot in the paneling. They paid her in lace, needles, and occasionally gossip about royal hat preferences. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were common knowledge or carefully kept secrets. Some argue that wall rentals were a symptom of Paris's housing crisis. Too many people, not enough legal space. Others see it as a darkly brilliant form of proto-subletting, complete with informal rules. Don't make noise, don't light fires, and never, ever speak to the neighbors. You slip past the vendor and crawl toward the rear of the space. You find a chalkboard nailed to the beam. On it are tallies, food items, hours worked, and a few coded notes you can't decipher. C7 owes me bread. L mother hiding again. No heat Thursday. A small pouch hangs beside it. Inside are scraps of paper, each bearing a request. Needles, matches, soap, dried plums. The wall vendor fills these over time, leaving the goods in a shared cavity, accessed by tugging a loose tile in the hallway ceiling. You peek through the vent and watch a hand reach up. It grabs a thimble and vanishes. Down below, the merchant family eats supper. They have no idea that just a few feet above them, an entire economy is clinking along like an off-brand clock. Someone passes behind you, a boy with soot-streaked cheeks and a bag of crusts. He grins as he goes. You smell something sweet. Roasted chestnuts? Where did he get those? There's a trade happening just ahead. A small candle stub for a pair of wool socks with mismatched toes. No words are exchanged. Just nods. Just that quiet look that says, I know what it's like. The people in these walls aren't criminals. They're survivors. They exist in a parallel system, one defined not by laws, but by limits. And within those limits, they've made room for sharing, for commerce, even for kindness. You follow the faint scent of melted wax to another vendor. This one's a man with ink-stained fingers and a cough he tries to muffle behind a scrap of velvet. He offers you 3 pages from a book of riddles, torn but legible. In exchange, he asks only for news, not headlines, not wars. Just, is the baker still playing that flute in the morning? You tell him yes. He smiles. Then I owe someone a coin. Because here's the secret no one talks about. Information is currency in the walls. Who left town? Who's getting married? Who's hiring? It's not gossip. It's survival. A fringe piece of this economy even included performances. One woman in a garret above a tavern would hum old troubadour songs through the wall vents on Thursdays. Patrons would leave her crusts, coins, Even wine dregs through a loose plank. She never spoke, but she never missed a Thursday. You crouch in a junction where 5 walls meet, a sort of crossroads. Carved into the wood are arrows, initials, and one phrase repeated: fair trade or no trade. It's not capitalism. It's necessity wrapped in dust and dignity. Above you, a thump, a squeak, a gentle curse in Breton. Someone's cooking something with lentils again. You hear a splash of water, a spoon clink, and the hiss of steam escaping through the vent. Another day in the wall economy. You back away, careful not to knock anything over, and find yourself in a narrow passage where dozens of chalk marks crowd the walls. Messages, ledgers, tiny shout-outs to no one in particular. Bread 2, buttons 4. Don't trust the rat near the curtain. The curtain in question flaps ahead of you, revealing another cavity, this one filled with hand-me-down shoes, most of them too small. Possibly barter stock, possibly memories. You exhale slowly. You're part of it now, at least for a moment. A guest in this barter-built city within a city. A ghost shopper with nothing to buy. But they don't mind. Here, even presence has value. The first thing you notice is the drip. Drip, drip, plip. It's coming from above. You glance up at the cracked plaster ceiling, and sure enough, there's a tiny slit in the wall. And from that slit hangs a thread of linen, barely visible, fluttering slightly as if caught in some invisible breeze. Then, another drip. This time, onto the edge of your boot. Laundry. Someone is doing laundry inside the wall. You tilt your head, not because you're surprised. At this point, you'd believe someone was roasting a duck behind the wainscoting, but because of the sheer audacity of it. Who hangs socks from an air vent? A wall dweller. That's who. You back up slightly and maneuver into a cramped vertical shaft, likely once used for waste removal or chimney draw, but now thoroughly repurposed. There's a warmth to the space and a smell, soapy, herbal, not entirely unpleasant, like someone accidentally boiled mint tea inside a boot. Halfway up, you catch a glimpse of her, the laundress of the wall. She's seated on a flat wooden board, bare feet tucked underneath her, scrubbing a cloth against a slab of stone. Her washing basin is a lopsided wooden bucket. The water inside it is gray and industrious. Nearby, she's rigged a clothesline from a length of twine and a bent spoon. On it hang 2 shirts, a scarf, and what might be a very brave attempt at underwear. She works quietly, expertly. There's no wasted motion. Every flick of her wrist seems rehearsed, like the rhythm of a song only she knows. Mainstream fact. In 17th century Paris, water was precious and not always clean. Most people got theirs from communal fountains or street vendors who hauled it in barrels. Doing laundry indoors was rare and frowned upon. It risked dampness, mildew, and unwanted moldy surprises. Yet here she is, doing precisely that in a wall. Fringe tidbit. There are anecdotal records, never formally confirmed, of certain tenants in overcrowded districts being fined not for living in wall spaces, but for suspending linens from illegal internal ducts, which is bureaucratic speak for please stop hanging your bloomers in the ceiling. You shift to a better vantage point. The laundress hums as she scrubs, a sleepy little tune, maybe a lullaby or something passed down from a village too small for maps. Her space is decorated with pressed flowers tucked into gaps in the wood. Some have browned with age, others are startlingly vibrant, as if refreshed with each wash. From a crevice near her elbow, steam drifts out. That's her drying vent, rigged to draw hot air from the baker's hearth 2 floors down. She's positioned her laundry precisely so the warmth dries it slowly, evenly. You get the feeling she's an engineer of sorts, or at least a professional, in making impossible things work. Historians still argue whether such wall-side laundresses were common or exceptional. Some insist that anyone washing clothes inside would have been caught immediately by the smell, the dripping, the sounds of sloshing. Others argue, in a city so densely packed, who would even notice? When the ceiling drips, most people assume it's their upstairs neighbor, not a woman quietly wringing out stockings between floorboards. She wrings out a blouse and slaps it rhythmically against the stone, left, right, left, before looping it gently over her twine line. The sound echoes faintly down the shaft. You remember the drip? That blouse, if you follow its corner, is precisely what landed on your boot a moment ago. She must sense your gaze because she pauses, looks toward you, not startled, just curious. Then she points a thumb upward and mouths, "Don't go up now." You nod. No questions. If she says it's not safe, it's not safe. Above, there's a muffled grunt. A bang. Someone else is moving through the ducts, likely hauling something or arguing with gravity. It's a reminder that even here, in a pocket of space barely large enough to iron a handkerchief, you're part of a bigger, wobblier ecosystem. The laundress reaches into a pouch and pulls out a small bar of soap. It's wrapped in cloth, marked with what looks like a family crest, probably nicked or bartered. She rubs it against a pair of trousers with the resignation of someone who knows the mud won't fully come out but tries anyway. In her world, clean is less about sparkle and more about function. A fresh start. A little control in a city that offers very little of it. You glance up again at the slit in the wall. Another drip. Somewhere below, a tenant probably just looked up and muttered, "Not again," before sliding a bucket into place. And the laundress? She probably chuckled softly and got on with it. There are dozens like her. Wall women and duct folk who've turned the forgotten arteries of Paris into domestic palaces the size of bread boxes. They cook, they clean, they stitch, they survive. And they do it with such steady grace that the rest of the city never even knows. A pigeon lands near her vent. She flicks her fingers and shoos it gently, like an old neighbor waving away an overeager child. There's a small mirror nailed to the wall beside her, cracked but clean. Beneath it, someone has etched into the wood, "Still me." You let that settle in. Laundry doesn't seem poetic until you realize it's an act of faith, of reclaiming something, of saying, "I am here and I deserve not to smell like soup." She hums again, and the steam coils upward. You leave her in peace, crawling back down the shaft, careful not to disturb her ecosystem of damp shirts and pressed violets. As you move away, the drip quiets, the air dries, and the scent of soap lingers like a whisper on your clothes. It starts with a whisper, not yours, not the laundress's, not even the murmuring flue dweller still boiling his lentils somewhere overhead. This is deeper, woven into the walls themselves, a whisper that carries stories like smoke, soft, constant, impossible to locate. You've slipped into one of the oldest buildings on the block now. The plaster is yellowed, the beams swollen with damp, and the sound here is layered. Conversations echo oddly, half heard, half imagined. Someone's laughing 3 rooms away, or maybe right next to you. It's hard to say. You're in the whispering walls now, not haunted, just heavily populated. And tonight, the gossip is especially juicy. You ease between 2 lath boards and find yourself in a space barely as wide as your shoulders. On one side, the dining room of a merchant's wife, whose guests are halfway through a discussion about the scandalous length of someone's prayer beads. On the other side, a boarding house. where two old men argue about who actually saw the king once in 1629. You, meanwhile, are in the gossip corridor, a narrow, resonant channel where voices pass through cracked mortar like messages in a bottle. It turns out, the people who lived in the walls didn't just survive off crumbs and hand-me-down candles. They also fed on talk. Mainstream fact, Parisian buildings in the 1600s weren't built for privacy. Walls were thin, ceilings shared beams, and fireplaces often connected multiple homes through a single chimney flue. If you said something out loud, there was a good chance someone else, 2 floors up, 4 rooms away, or crouched in a wall, heard it. And for the wall dwellers, eavesdropping wasn't just accidental. It was a way of life. Information meant opportunity. Who was leaving town? Who was flush with cash? Who was hiring? Who had too much wine and not enough discretion? You crouch now beside a small panel with a carved hole no wider than a thimble. Someone's placed a cone of paper in it, carefully rolled, forming an old-fashioned ear trumpet. It's pointed directly at a salon where a rather boisterous discussion about the peculiar smell coming from the hallway is taking place. Someone on the other side chuckles, a soft exhale. They've heard it too. This cavity you're in now was never meant to be a hallway, but it's become one, a narrow route used by those who want to listen, deliver, and sometimes gently meddle. Fringe tidbit. In a court transcript from 1663, a nobleman accused his neighbor of tampering with the help. It turned out the help had simply been passing love notes through the wall to the next house, using the hollow behind the hearth as a makeshift mailbox. Historians still debate whether the man was more upset about the note passing or the poetry involved. The gossip corridor has its regulars. A wiry girl with a smudge of soot on her chin leans against a beam, eating a plum and smirking at the conversation next door. She mouths along with the lady of the house's dramatic story. She's clearly heard this one before. "You'd think Madame Dupont invented fainting," the girl whispers, then rolls her eyes and disappears into the dark, still chewing. You follow the warmth of her laughter down the beam line and find another cluster of wall dwellers, 3 of them, crouched around a knot in the wood that serves as a peephole into the adjoining sitting room. They don't speak. They just listen. One jots something in chalk on the beam beside her. "Gone Tuesday." It's not malicious. It's not theft. It's coordination. If the merchant's going to be gone Tuesday, maybe there's an odd job to pick up, or a space to borrow, or just a chance to breathe. Historians still argue whether this kind of listening network was organized or spontaneous. Was there a wall code? A language of knocks and whistles? Some suggest yes. A few odd pamphlets survive, filled with cryptic phrases like 3 creaks and a hush and look for the spoon nail. Others dismiss these as literary nonsense, the urban legendary of the underhoused. But you've seen the chalk marks. You've seen the ear cone. You've heard the whispers stitched like thread through the wood. This wasn't just shelter. It was surveillance, social web, and survival system. In one cavity, you spot a shrine of sorts. A cracked mirror, a smoothed stone, a tiny curl of paper listing names and birthdays. Beside it is another chalk phrase, "Tell no lie near the flue." You hear a rustle above, another listener shifting in their post. Everyone hears everyone, and somehow it works. A young man slides past you, barefoot, balancing a shallow bowl of soup. He doesn't speak, but nods toward a beam. Beneath it, someone stirs. A woman reaches out and takes the bowl without looking. They don't exchange a word. They don't need to. Because earlier, someone heard that she was sick, and someone passed it on, and someone cared enough to make soup. This is the slow, humming kindness that lives in the cracks. You move again, fingers tracing grooves where hundreds of fingers have moved before. These walls are polished with life. You press your ear to a new spot and hear a story about someone's disastrous dinner with a bishop. Another panel reveals the sounds of laughter, genuine, belly deep, the sort of laugh that can only exist in a place where no one knows you're listening. And behind you, someone sneezes. "Bless you," comes a voice from 2 beams away. You smile. In this hidden corridor of murmurs and crumbs, you realize that the wall dwellers didn't just survive the city. They made it intelligible. They mapped it in gossip, tracked it with ears, and stitched it together with quiet companionship. This is the heartbeat of Paris that never made it into the architecture books, and it's still pulsing, soft, steady, and always slightly off rhythm with the world outside. You're deeper in now. Not metaphorically, though sure, let's pretend it's symbolic, but literally. You're crawling through the part of a once grand Parisian residence where floor meets wall meets absolute architectural confusion. The boards slope here, the nails don't match, and somewhere just ahead you hear a lullaby being sung in the wrong key. You edge forward. The space opens slightly, just enough to kneel, and what you see now stills you. A child, alone, in a pocket of wall about the size of a traveling trunk, surrounded by faded cloth scraps, a chipped tin cup, and what looks like a wooden soldier missing its arms. The child hums to herself, off-tempo but persistent, as she wraps her blanket tighter and glances at a candle stub lodged carefully into the floorboards. This is one of the crawl-space orphans. You've heard about them in fragments, whispers in ledgers, accidental mentions in servants' journals, sudden disappearances no one followed up on. But here's the truth. In 17th century Paris, not all children belonged to someone. Some simply didn't. And some of those ended up here, in the walls. Mainstream fact: orphaned or abandoned children were a tragic but very real part of early modern urban life. While Paris did have foundling hospitals, most notably the Hôpital des Enfants Trouvés, these were often overcrowded and underfunded. Not every child made it there. Some slipped through the cracks, literally. You shift slightly, and the child's eyes flick to yours. Wide, brown, not frightened, just used to people appearing and disappearing like mice. She holds out a hand, and with it, a piece of bread. Not much, but it's the best part of her day, and she's willing to share. You accept it. Of course you do. She doesn't speak, but she gestures to a corner of her space where a folded cloth hides a stash of treasures: a broken spoon, a doll's shoe, a button engraved with something you can't read. These are her world, her lineage, in objects no one else wanted, fringe tidbit. In a recovered wall cavity in the Marais district, workers discovered what they first thought was a rat's nest, until they found within it a child-sized blanket, small handwriting etched into a beam, and a painted stone labeled Maman. No family ever came forward, no records matched, just a presence, long faded. Historians still argue whether these orphans lived in the walls as part of larger servant networks, taken in unofficially, hidden out of pity, or whether they survived independently, scavenging through hollow timbers and narrow ducts. Probably both. Paris didn't deal in absolutes, especially not for the small and invisible. You sit with her now, sharing silence. Through a cracked plank, you hear music from the parlor, a harpsichord piece, lilting and delicate. The girl sways slightly, not to the music itself, but to a rhythm only she hears. Her blanket is stitched from rags. One corner bears an embroidered initial, L. Maybe hers, maybe not. You spot another child, older, crawling in from the shaft. He ducks into the niche and hands her something. An apple core, maybe, or a wrapped bit of cheese. He's her courier, her brother, her guardian, her neighbor. Maybe all four. He doesn't speak either, just pats her on the shoulder and leaves again. These children don't beg on the streets. They're too small, too quiet, too tucked away. They are ghosts in training, but not lifeless, not passive. You watch the girl as she carefully scratches something into the wall with a nail. It's not words, it's shapes, stars, circles, a rabbit, a crown, her history, written in what little space she controls. And suddenly the walls around you don't feel like hiding places. They feel like diaries, worn smooth with the pressing need to be remembered. She tucks the nail back under a plank and lies down. Her eyes flutter. Her breathing slows. She dreams probably of open skies, or bread that doesn't come in halves, or a room where the music isn't muffled by 30 feet of wood and plaster. You stand, or rather stoop, and make your way back through the tunnel. Along the way, you pass another cavity. This one's empty now, but you find traces. A piece of chalk, a cracked mug, a drawing of a dog, and what appears to be a loaf of bread with legs. The work of a wall child, long since grown or gone. Sometimes landlords found them, usually after a wall collapsed. There were official reports, yes, but always phrased awkwardly. Unclaimed minor, unauthorized inhabitant. One inspector's notes simply said, child removed, left behind a spool of thread. You crawl onward, another chamber. 2 children asleep in parallel lines like luggage. Above their heads, someone's carved a message into the beam. If you read this, bring milk. It's hard to say if it was ever answered. This is the part of wall life no one talked about in salons or diaries. Not even the servants spoke of it openly. Because to speak, it was to make it real. And reality sometimes is too much. But the children persisted. In the forgotten places, the forgotten ways. You leave behind one more tiny alcove with a single sock and a piece of twine shaped into a heart. You don't disturb it. It's a monument. You crawl on, the candlelight flickering ahead. Somewhere, a child stirs in her sleep and hums again. The same lullaby, just slightly off key. The walls are getting narrower again. You have to twist your shoulders to fit now, shifting sideways like a letter being slid under a door. Dust clings to your sleeves. Your knees ache from crawling. But the sound ahead, louder than the soft murmurs and lullabies you've grown used to, draws you forward. Voices, frustrated ones. You press an ear to the wood and listen. But if they're not technically inside the apartment, a sigh, then, I'm telling you they're living in the walls. They've got some kind of setup. Another voice, sharper. They're not on the lease. That's all the court will care about. Ah, you found it. A legal dispute. The kind of bureaucratic comedy that could only unfold in a world where Parisian walls have tenants. You slink down into the paneling beside a crumbling chimney breast and peer through a long crack in the lath. Beyond it is a salon now stripped bare. Just 2 men, a sheaf of papers, and a candle burning dangerously close to a curtain. The air is tense. So is the wall. This isn't the kind of wall-dweller drama you might expect. No rats, no soup pots, no small children peeking out with haunted eyes. This is paperwork. The stiff rustling of lawsuits and leases, the sound of a landlord's sanity gradually fraying at the seams. The plaintiffs are furious. The defendants, practically invisible. Mainstream fact. As urban overcrowding worsened in 17th century Paris, legal disputes over housing grew more absurd by the year. There are documented cases of people being evicted not from apartments, but from adjacent structural cavities. These weren't technically rooms, and because of that, people argued they weren't technically occupied. Hence the courtroom madness. Was a person in a wall inside the house, or part of it? One recorded complaint, dated 1659, reads, "The accused did knowingly install himself behind the chimney flue, not as a tenant, but as a parasite." The term parasite in that context meant someone who fed off a host, in this case, the building, without acknowledgement or rent. It didn't help that the accused was reportedly making a small income sharpening knives for neighbors by passing them through a wall hole like a very aggressive lending library. You crawl closer into the floor cavity now and catch sight of the central issue. There is, in fact, a person living in the wall. More than one. A family by the looks of it. 2 adults, maybe a teenage daughter, maybe a cousin who no one really knows, but who brought flour once, so now he lives here. Their living space is ingeniously built. Wooden boards for sleeping platforms, a crate suspended by rope for lifting food, and what looks like a curtain made of stitched-together handkerchiefs to cover the crawlway entrance. It's small, cramped, but organized. They haven't spoken yet, but they're clearly listening to the argument on the other side of the wall. The mother holds a hand against the paneling, as if trying to feel the temperature of the rage outside. And here's the wild thing. They're not intruding. Technically. They're living in the gap between 2 buildings, what was once an insulation buffer, left hollow by mismatched construction. No doors lead there, no plumbing. It's like someone forgot to claim a square of space in a board game, and they just moved in. Fringe tidbit. One famous case involved a seamstress who lived for over a decade inside the dividing wall between a bakery and a boarding house. She paid no rent, filed no address, and left only when the wall was demolished to install indoor toilets. Her belongings were so neatly tucked into niches that it took the workmen hours to realize someone had been living there. Historians still argue whether these legal gray zones should be viewed as early squatter rights or as evidence of a broken housing system. The documents suggest both. Judges were baffled, inspectors indifferent, and landlords absolutely beside themselves, like the man currently gesturing wildly with his lease document. "They eat my bread, they knock my pipes." "Sir," says the other man calmly, "your lease covers square footage, not cubic surprises." You nearly laugh, but you don't want to give yourself away. The Wall family continues to sit quietly. The mother knits, perhaps out of nerves, perhaps because there's simply nothing else to do. The daughter scribbles on a scrap of parchment. The cousin is asleep with his head on a sack of carrots. They're waiting it out. They've probably done this before. You spot an opening in the panel, tiny, thumb-sized. Someone's carved the word "ours" beside it, possession, or a prayer. The legal argument fades into exasperated muttering. They're going to try the courts again. File a new complaint. Possibly bring in a carpenter to prove someone shouldn't physically be able to fit in there. Good luck with that. You back away, past another chamber where a pile of flour sacks hides a makeshift stool and a small, hopeful stack of books. La Fontaine's Fables, The Lives of the Saints, and a very slim booklet titled Useful Things to Know If the Wall Falls Down. It's handwritten. You pass yet another chalk note scrawled into the beams. Not a room, not a rent. Hard to argue with. You crawl back into darkness, leaving the family behind their thin wall, the arguments fading behind you like an old echo. They'll stay, at least for now, until someone rips open the plaster or the city decides it wants that last cubic meter of space back. But for the moment, they belong. Not in the lease, not in the registry, just in the wall. There's something different in the air now. Less soot, less broth, more incense. Earthy, herbal, a whiff of something resinous with a hint of beeswax. It leads you gently, like a rope of scent through the dark. The light changes too. You move past another crooked timber, duck beneath a beam that feels oddly warm, and emerge into a space bathed in the amber glow of candlelight. And it's quiet here, quiet in a way that feels chosen. You're in a monastery, or more precisely, behind a monastery wall. You pause, listen. Somewhere nearby, someone is chanting softly. A single voice, low and rhythmic, more vibration than song. You can't make out the words, but they wrap around the space like a blanket. Then you see it, a narrow alcove carved into the stone, padded with folded cloth and lined with script-covered scraps of parchment. A man sits there, cross-legged and utterly still, his fingers curled over a string of wooden prayer beads. He's facing the wall, not in fear or punishment, but in focus. He is sealed into the wall, on purpose. You've met your first wall hermit. Mainstream fact: in certain religious orders, particularly among mystics and ascetics in 17th century France, a tradition existed, though rare, of reclusion volontaire, or voluntary enclosure. Some individuals would choose to live confined within cells or cloisters for years at a time, believing that detachment from the world brought them closer to divine clarity. Most chose small rooms or sealed garden huts, but some, especially in crowded monastic quarters, found their sanctums inside the very walls of the structure. This man, he's not poor, he's not hiding, he's practicing, and his chamber, while humble, is deliberate. Carefully arranged candles, a cup of water, a tiny wooden crucifix carved into the mortar. He doesn't look at you, doesn't acknowledge you at all. He's miles away in his mind, even though you could touch his elbow if you leaned. Fringe tidbit: there are at least 2 documented cases in France where monks bricked themselves into wall recesses for spiritual devotion, living there for years. One even left behind a small journal, now held in a Dijon archive, in which he wrote daily updates. Light from crack above strong today. Mind drifted. Recentered with Psalm 77. Historians still debate whether this practice was endorsed or merely tolerated by religious leadership. In some abbeys, these hermits were respected, even revered. In others, they were dismissed as eccentric or spiritually arrogant. But the walls didn't judge. They just made space. You shift into another section of the monastery's understructure and pass a second niche. This one empty now, but bearing the clear imprint of its former occupant. There's an indentation in the stone where a head once rested, a shallow bowl, scratches in the plaster, tiny notches, perhaps counting days, perhaps prayers. And in the beam above, silence is the truest form. Not everyone in the monastery understood this life. Some of the kitchen brothers would leave food tucked in through a small hole in the plaster, just above the floor. Others whispered that the hermits had visions. One claimed to hear them speaking to angels at night, or rats. No one could agree. You move on. The walls here are thicker, older, less wood and more ancient stone. The monastery itself predates most of the city around it. This part was never meant to be inhabited. But as you've learned, if there's a crevice, someone will claim it. Another whisper of incense draws you to a third cavity, this one a tight, triangular space behind the chapel. Inside, a woman sits curled on a mat of woven reeds, fingers tracing lines in an open book. She's not a nun exactly, her robe is unmarked. but she hums in the rhythm of the liturgy, and her face carries the gentle focus of someone who's been still for a very, very long time. She notices you, offers the barest nod, then resumes her reading. You see herbs drying on a string near her shoulder, sage, thyme, maybe lavender. She's made this place into something between a cell and a garden. You half expect a bird to flutter down and roost on her shoulder. Fringe detail. While not officially sanctioned, some convents are rumored to have harbored women in spiritual seclusion, laywomen who sought isolation but didn't take full vows. Their presence in the walls wasn't listed in any record books, but letters survive referring to our silent sisters and to meals set aside for the one who watches the world in quiet. Historians still argue, were these women escaping something or seeking it? The walls offer no answers. You notice something odd as you leave her alcove, the soft sound of writing. You follow it to a sloped corridor where a monk, his back hunched, his robes dusted with plaster, is scribbling fervently onto parchment, balanced on a wooden board. He's wedged himself between two support beams, clearly uncomfortable, clearly been here for hours. You peek over his shoulder. He's copying texts by hand, old ones, illuminated ones. His script is cramped but beautiful. Between his elbow and the wall is a bowl of ink, a nub of wax, and a crust of bread he's forgotten to eat. He pauses, licks his finger, and turns the page with religious reverence. He doesn't live in this wall, not exactly, but he visits it often enough to call it home. This monastery, you realize, has its own rhythm, its own hidden population. The wall dwellers here aren't lost. They're exactly where they want to be, tucked out of the world, folded into its spine like footnotes in a holy book. You back away slowly, the smell of incense still warming your nose. A breeze passes through the cracks. The chanting continues. The wall breathes, and you step out, carrying their quiet with you. You feel the change before you see it. The warmth vanishes. The scent of incense fades, replaced by dust and grease and something slightly metallic. Stage paint, maybe, or costume glue left too long in the heat. You've slipped sideways, not far from the monastery, but into an entirely different world, the underbelly of Parisian theater, specifically the walls behind the stage. It's darker here, cluttered. The wood beneath your knees is worn smooth in some places, cracked in others, like the skin of a tired performer. And just ahead, light. A soft flickering glow spills through a slat in the wall. Voices, laughter, the faint trill of a harpsichord. The show is beginning. You edge closer to the source of the light and find yourself peering through a knothole into the backstage of a small opera house. You've arrived precisely at the moment when an over-powdered baritone belts a note that rattles your ribs. No one in the audience suspects that just a few feet away, a man sits in total silence, crammed between wallboards, watching a show he once starred in. You've found one of Paris's shadow performers. Mainstream fact: theater culture flourished in 17th century France. From court entertainments to more risque performances in the city's taverns, the stage became both a spectacle and a battleground of status. But for every celebrated actor, dozens were dismissed, blackballed, or simply forgotten, pushed out by age, scandal, or lack of patronage. And some of them never really left. The man behind the wall is in his 50s, maybe older. A red scarf tied around his neck like a relic from a costume long out of fashion. He leans forward, eyes fixed on the stage through the wall, mouthing the lines of a character he once played. His hands twitch in time with the gestures. You get the feeling he knows every part in the show. Still, His little hollow is decorated with props: a cracked mask, a bent tin crown, a crumpled playbill from years ago where his name is printed third from the top. He's not haunting the theater. He's inhabiting it. Fringe tidbit. One unsigned letter from 1681 describes a mumbling ghost in the Théâtre du Marais who could be heard reciting lines through the walls at night. Stagehands claimed it wasn't supernatural at all, just old Florent, who once played kings and now plays no one. Theater walls weren't just filled with voices, they were saturated with memories, and for some, memories were enough to live on. You crawl to another opening, this one wider, overlooking a dressing room. A young actress powders her cheeks while a boy, possibly her brother, possibly her unpaid assistant, adjusts the ribbons on her costume. She doesn't know she's being watched from the wall. Behind you, another hidden figure is watching too. A woman this time. You didn't even hear her arrive. She presses her fingers to a gap in the plaster, eyes gleaming as the actress laughs at some backstage joke. The woman's mouth moves. She's saying something, quiet, unheard. You realize she's mouthing advice, stage direction, maybe a critique. Old habits die hard. This wall is more than a hiding place. It's a box seat for those the stage has left behind. Historians still argue how many former performers took refuge in the backstage walls. Few admit to it outright, and the playbills never mention where you sleep when you're no longer paid to wear tights and speak in rhyme. But anecdotal evidence is there. Memoirs of costumers, letters from musicians, one confessional from a stage manager who claimed he fed 3 retired spirits through a vent behind the third curtain. Some even worked small jobs, in secret, mending costumes at night, whispering lines to nervous actors through the walls. One reportedly taught a mute boy how to fake a dramatic death, using only gestures and an impressively timed groan. You shift in your narrow perch and feel something crunch. Paper, a playbill. You unfold it. The Tragedy of Artemisia, featuring the incomparable Monsieur Lefebvre. You glance back through the knothole. The man in the red scarf bows slightly, as if he heard his name. Then, as the soprano on stage lets loose an impressive high note, he closes his eyes and mouths it perfectly. He's not sad. He's transported. You wonder how many times he's watched this same scene, how many years he's been the audience to a show he used to star in, and yet he never claps, never leaves, just sits, listens, relives. Another wall chamber up the catwalk contains a makeshift library, scripts stacked like sacred texts, cue notes scribbled on old parchment, costume sketches drawn with trembling fingers. Someone, maybe many someones, have built a life around what was left behind when the curtain fell. Not all who live in these theater walls are old. One crawl space reveals a teenager humming scales softly, tracing letters into the soot with a finger. She's rehearsing, preparing, maybe waiting for her moment, maybe sneaking into rehearsals she'll never be invited to join. For now, she learns by watching, and the stage keeps glowing, glittering, pretending the world is orderly and scripted. Meanwhile, in the walls, the real drama lives on, unsung, unseen, but never forgotten. You pull back from the knothole just as the act ends. Applause thunders through the wood. The wall itself seems to shiver with it. The man in the scarf smiles softly, then disappears into the shadows. No curtain call, just a quiet exit, back into the place where forgotten actors watch in peace, and the wall holds all the world's best lines. The applause fades behind you like a dream just out of reach. You slide along a cold timber beam, past a dangling thread of costume silk and the faint scent of theatrical grease paint. And soon the mood shifts again. The wall air grows denser, heavier. The silence here isn't peaceful, it's watchful. You're in the shadowy layers of a home not far from the Place de Grève, where markets are loud, where executions are louder, and where fear seeps through the floorboards like mildew. The plaster here is cracked in odd places, not from age, but from stress. You can feel it, like the building remembers something it's not proud of. Because now we've entered a darker chapter of Parisian wall life, when simply existing within the walls could get you accused of something far worse than trespassing. This is the era of suspicion, of sudden whispers and closed shutters, of witch hunts. Mainstream fact: while France's witch trials never reached the fevered pitch of other European countries, the 17th century still saw waves of paranoia, especially in rural areas and poorer districts of cities like Paris. Superstition mingled with religious anxiety, and accusations fell most often on women, foreigners, and the invisible poor. And guess who qualified as invisible? The people in the walls. You peer through a cracked panel into a kitchen, quiet now, but once full of heat and spice and muttered prayers. It belonged, you learn, to a midwife, or a herbalist, or possibly both. She vanished one winter. No trial, no funeral, just gone. The records say she fled. The neighbors say she dissolved. The wall says otherwise, because as you lean your hand against a hollow section near the hearth, it gives way slightly, just enough to reveal a sliver of space behind the oven, a compartment, a hiding place, maybe a sanctuary, maybe a cell. Inside it, dried herbs tied with twine, a scrap of red cloth, a small clay figure with faded paint and no arms, something ritualistic or just forgotten. Fringe tidbit. One recovered wall niche near Montmartre was found to contain a bundle of coins, bits of bone, and a wooden comb carved with tiny symbols. Scholars still debate whether it was a charm, a cache, or just the belongings of someone trying to disappear. You crawl upward into another wall channel, this one barely passable, just enough for a child or a desperate adult. And in the dark, you hear it, breathing. Slow, careful, practiced. The occupant knows not to be heard. This person, maybe a healer, maybe just unlucky, has chosen the wall not for shelter, but for hiding. From the church, from the neighbors, from the strange swell of public fear that turns poverty into malevolence and difference into danger. They live in silence, surrounded by little protections. A carved stone, a dried snake skin, an iron pin bent into a loop. Someone once accused a wall dweller of bewitching a pig into walking backward. That was all it took. Suddenly, every creak in the house, every missing spoon, every sour batch of bread became her fault. And once you're blamed, you don't leave your hiding spot. You stay. You fade. You fold into the structure and hope time forgets. Historians still argue whether the so-called witch hunts of urban Paris targeted real communities or were simply convenient purges of the unseen. Either way, the results were the same. Wall dwellers moved less, whispered more, and learned to make themselves as undetectable as floor dust. You pass a message scratched into the wood. Don't knock. They'll hear. Beneath it, a smear that might be wax, might be blood. In a nearby crawl space, you find a woman huddled beneath a cloth bundle. Her hands are stained with something dark, ink maybe, or dye. Her eyes flick to yours, and for a heartbeat, you expect her to scream, but she doesn't. She simply lifts a finger to her lips. Silence, always silence. You nod, back away. Let her keep her breath. Down the beam line, the structure warps into what might have once been a grain storage loft. It's empty now, save for bundles of straw tied into strange shapes, triangles, loops, spirals, protection symbols, messages, warnings. One is marked with charcoal. She saved my baby. You understand then? These weren't witches. They were midwives, herbalists, outsiders who knew how to keep bread from molding and babies from dying, and were punished for it by a society that feared what it didn't understand. And so they took to the walls, not for warmth, but for safety. You pass another panel with a peephole. Through it, the main room of a house is visible, where a priest is blessing salt and murmuring over a pile of fresh wood. He believes his new tenant is cursed. His new tenant is a laundress. You recognize her. From earlier, she's cursed only in that she survives in a city that offers no welcome mat, and perhaps she still lives partly in the wall, listening, watching, avoiding the sort of attention that used to end in smoke and ash. In one narrow chamber, someone has etched a message deeply into the beam. The wall keeps the truth warm. You linger there a moment, let the silence sit, then crawl onward, past feathers, pinched candles, and the strange smell of rosemary that doesn't seem to fade. The fear has ebbed now. Paris moves on quickly, but its walls remember, and so do you. You're high up again now, near the rafters of a once opulent house, its ceiling long warped by rain and time. It's the kind of place that looks regal from the street, but folds inward the moment you look too close. You creep through a half-rotted beam passage, careful not to breathe too hard, because up here, even the dust feels judgmental. You've entered the attic, but not the clean, romantic kind with sunlight beams and forgotten trunks. This is something else. A catacomb, not underground, but above the parlors and drawing rooms of the Parisian elite. Up here, bones lie next to buttons, and the walls sag with secrets nobody ever meant to store. At first, you think it's just clutter, old furniture, broken pots, piles of papers too curled to read. But then you see the bones, carefully arranged, not in piles, but in patterns. Some human, some animal, some possibly decorative, though you'd rather not think too hard about that. You've found the hoarders of the walls. Mainstream fact. In early modern Paris, it wasn't uncommon for upper floors, especially attics, to be rented unofficially, used as storage by staff, or simply forgotten. And as wall-dwelling communities evolved, so did the habit of gathering. For many who lived unseen, collecting became a form of control, of remembrance, of survival. You step carefully over a line of pebbles shaped into a spiral. Someone's shrine, or ward, or stress relief project. On a nearby beam scrawled in soot, "Keep what they forget." A woman shuffles past you in the dark. She's small, almost bird-like, with a heavy shawl and 2 different shoes. She carries a basket filled with spoons. Just spoons. Some polished, some broken, all clearly important. She doesn't acknowledge you, just vanishes into a side nook, muttering softly about the ones who leave behind too much silver. Another attic wall opens, and inside it you see a man hunched over what looks like a scroll made from flattened flour sacks. He's writing on it with charcoal, maps, notes, a list of everything he's found in the floorboards. 1 thimble, 3 glass beads, 2 coins, 1 tooth. He's making an inventory of a forgotten world. Historians still argue whether these attic hoarders were mentally ill, opportunistic scavengers, or simply practical. Some collected scraps for resale. Others preserved objects for memory's sake, tokens of a life erased from view. Fringe tidbit. During the demolition of an old townhouse in the early 1700s, workers discovered an attic crawl space that contained over 400 small items: dolls, candle ends, hairpins, a child's rattle, and dozens of carefully preserved ribbons. Some theorize it belonged to a former nursemaid who stayed behind long after the family moved away. You duck into another rafter channel and spot a row of jars, each labeled with chalk. June rain. Soot from kitchen 3. Ink drops. Someone is bottling sensations. You hear humming. It leads you to a pocket behind a chimney vent, where a woman sits cross-legged before what can only be described as a museum. Buttons arranged by color. Fabric swatches pinned to wood. Bits of parchment labeled in minuscule script. She looks up and smiles faintly. People throw away the wrong things, she says, then gestures to her collection. They forget their stories. I keep them. You nod. She returns to her work, dusting a coin with a feather, as if restoring the Louvre in her own private crumbling cathedral. Everywhere you look, there are signs of this strange attic archive. A row of shoes lined up by size, a rope made of mismatched yarns, a sketch of a woman's face drawn on the underside of a floorboard. Beneath it, a note. Saw her once. Wanted to remember. And the bones, yes, those again. You step into a shadowed corner and find a neat stack of tiny skulls. Not human, rats, each positioned with care. One even has a ribbon tied around it. A warning? A ritual? Or just someone's idea of decoration? No one's here to explain. Just the wind whispering through the shingles like a librarian sighing. You pass what was once a pigeon coop, long overtaken by fabric scraps and buttons. A wall dweller pokes his head out and offers you a handful of dried rose petals. For scent, he mutters. The bones complain otherwise. And then there's the journal. You almost miss it, wedged between two beams, half rotted and mold-speckled. But the pages inside are surprisingly intact. It's written in cramped, delicate script. Found a comb today. Ivory. Someone must have missed it badly. Tucked it beside the baby's sock from May. That makes 12 lost babies and 6 found letters. I keep the feathers separate. They don't like the letters. You sit back on your heels. This isn't hoarding. It's mourning. Remembering. Curating the lives of people who lived in the gaps and were forgotten in the records. And perhaps, like the catacombs below the city, these attic catacombs are a kind of monument. A memory palace for those without names, but plenty of stuff. You shift toward the crawlway. One last time reading the words scratched into the beam above. The things we keep are the proof we were here. You whisper it once to yourself, then vanish back into the dark. You shimmy down a crooked beam that vibrates with every gust of wind from the roof above, the wood groaning as if it, too, regrets its choices. A faint trail of ash marks the way forward, an old burn line, maybe from a candle, maybe something worse. The temperature rises, only slightly, but enough to make you pause. The air feels different here, like someone exhaled into a glove and sealed it. It's warmer, heavier, and suddenly you're aware of an acrid scent. Char, smoke, and something almost sweet underneath. Someone's built a fireplace, and judging by the scorched beam you're straddling, they didn't build it well. You slide closer and find the source. A tiny hearth, tucked into the wall like an afterthought. A shallow pit, lined with bricks and ash, with a crude iron pipe punched through to vent the smoke. It's ambitious, and more than a little dangerous. You've entered the chapter of the Parisian wall life titled, How Not to Build a Fireplace. Mainstream fact. In 17th century Paris, fire was both a constant comfort and a constant threat. Many homes were heated by open hearths, with chimneys built hastily or retrofitted as cities expanded. Fire safety codes? Barely a concept. Combine that with improvised wall dwellers trying to warm themselves in spaces never meant to house flames, and, well, you can guess how that went. You find a man crouched beside the tiny hearth, his face flushed with heat and pride. He pokes at the embers with a bent fork. The flames spit weakly, as if they, too, are unsure of their commitment. "Built it myself," he whispers. "Took me a week, almost lost an eyebrow." You can see the singe marks on his fringe. He grins like a child showing off a dangerous invention. There's no chimney cap, no real insulation. The wall behind him is visibly scorched, a smear of black rising like smoke's ghost. A precarious setup. And yet, it's warmer than anything you've encountered so far. You back away slightly, giving him space, and slide into a parallel cavity that reeks of old wool and soot. Here you find the remnants of other heating attempts, a clay pot stuffed with coals, a pan balanced on a brick stack, a crushed lantern melted into a floorboard. Fringe tidbit, some wall dwellers reportedly used heated stones, warmed outside or borrowed from kitchen ovens, to create small pockets of warmth that could last an hour or two. Others snuck hot bricks under their bedding, a practice borrowed from inns, but wildly riskier when your bed is made of kindling and guesswork. And then there were those who simply relied on layering. You pass a sleeping alcove stuffed with quilts, shawls, even strips of curtain. Someone's cocooned themselves into a linen burrito. No fire, no light, just breath and faith. But for every cautious dweller, there's a daring one. You come across another cavity, this one charred around the edges. It hasn't been used in a while. A lone kettle sits at an angle, its handle warped, the wall behind it blistered. A failed experiment, etched into the soot-covered beam. Too hot. Not again. You crawl upward into a larger space where two wall dwellers are mid-debate over where to position their new and improved vent shaft. One gestures animatedly with a stick of chalk. The other just shrugs and says, "As long as it doesn't kill the cat this time." There is, in fact, a cat. It's fine. For now. Historians still argue how many fires in Paris were caused by illegal wall hearths. Official records often cite unattended embers or chimney blockage, but rarely list the name of someone who technically didn't exist in the lease. One anonymous note in a building ledger reads, "Wall man tried to roast chestnuts. Roasted floor instead." You slide past a panel where smoke stains streak the wall like desperate brush strokes. The room beyond is empty, long abandoned. But a soot print of a hand remains on the timber. You lay your palm over it. A perfect fit. The need for warmth was universal. But in the walls, it came with a price. You find a diagram scratched into plaster. Lines, arrows, notations like "good draw here" and "avoid sparks." Someone tried to engineer a better way, a safer heat. You pause. A patch of plaster nearby is cracked. Behind it, a long-forgotten flue, a real one, professionally installed once but now bricked over at both ends. A wall dweller has found it and turned it into a heat chamber, coals at the base, vents carved into the side. It works. Ingenious. Mostly terrifying. You hear coughing nearby. Someone's been inhaling too much smoke. You follow the sound, find a small boy hunched in a vent shaft, wrapped in a singed blanket. His eyes are watery. His breath rattles. But he holds a tin mug close, filled with warm water and a chunk of boiled onion. "You can't boil onions without fire," he says hoarsely, then sips. You nod. Can't argue with logic like that. Somewhere down below, a floorboard creaks. A tenant bangs a broom on the ceiling, muttering about smoke. The boy just chuckles. They think it's the neighbors. It's always the neighbors. You crawl away slowly, smoke curling in your nose, eyes stinging. Your clothes are already soaked in the scent of 10 different types of fire, all of them wrong. But every wall dweller you passed, every risk-taker with a fork and a coal pot, reminds you, this isn't just survival, it's defiance. A flicker of control in a city that offered them none, even if it means warming yourself next to something that might, at any moment, burn everything down. It's early morning now, judging by the shift in temperature and the faint rise of light pushing through the hairline cracks in the roof above. The city beyond the walls is beginning to stir. Carts rattle, hooves clop. Someone shouts about bread being too expensive, which is timeless. But inside the wall, something else is stirring. Paper. You hear it before you see it. The soft shuffle of parchment, the occasional frustrated grunt, and the telltale thump of a quill dropping to the floor. You follow the sounds down a gentle slope in the rafters, past a broken weather vane poking through the roof like a rusted exclamation point. You're not in a home or a storage cavity now. You're in a counting chamber. Welcome to the wall census. You duck under a beam and into a narrow space that smells like musty ink and dried sweat. A man sits hunched over a makeshift desk, 2 crates stacked and a board balanced across the top. He's surrounded by scrolls, lists, tiny ledgers. His hair's a mess, and there's an inkwell tucked into a sock to keep it from tipping. He doesn't look up as you enter, just mutters, "If the chimneys count as an address, I'll eat my quill." This is a city clerk. Well, technically, a temporary assistant to a clerk. He's been sent on a fool's errand to count the invisible. Mainstream fact: in 1666, a royal ordinance from Louis XIV ordered an updated accounting of Paris's population. Not just property owners, but tenants, boarders, staff, even transient persons, and individuals residing in unlisted quarters. It was part tax audit, part social control. It also immediately collapsed under its own ambition, because of the wall dwellers. This man, let's call him Laurent, because he looks like a Laurent, was tasked with cataloging these informal inhabitants. What he found was an entire alternate Paris he couldn't explain. He gestures at a scroll. 3 people living behind a tailor's bench. 1 child in a laundry chute. Someone, possibly 2 people, in the space between 2 outhouse walls. I don't even know what to call that. Do you just write? Between. He's been crawling for weeks now, interviewing whoever will talk, estimating when they won't, and discovering that for every 1 person with a name, 5 more exist only as shadows. Fringe tidbit. A partial census record discovered centuries later includes the phrase 4 souls listed within structural cavity, north-facing. Occupants do not claim address. Occupants do not claim to exist. Possibly a clerk's joke. Possibly not. Laurent shows you a map. It's hand-drawn, shaking with ink bleeds and covered in annotations. It doesn't chart streets. It charts hollows, pockets of wall space, ducts, rafters. He's created a blueprint of unofficial Paris, the Paris between plaster. "Do you know," he says, without looking up, "that I found an entire family living behind a schoolroom blackboard? I thought they were ghosts at first. Then the daughter offered me a muffin." He grins faintly. "Best muffin I've had in months." Historians still argue whether the 1666 census ever tried to include wall dwellers in earnest. Some say it was a gesture, a way to seem thorough. Others think there were genuine efforts by a few sympathetic bureaucrats to account for everyone, no matter how well hidden. Laurent, if he existed, may have been one of them. He pulls a scroll from a side pouch and unrolls it. dozens of names, some partial, some strange. Lil Claude lives by the soup flue. Woman who sings Thursdays. Twins, probably, impossible to tell. It's a registry of the unregistered. You notice a section labeled Echo People. They move, he says quietly. Sometimes you count them in one wall, then a week later, they're behind a different fireplace. It's like the city breathes, and they float with it. He sighs, rubs his eyes, and knocks over a pile of quills. They scatter like pickup sticks. 73 people, he mutters. That's just in the Saint-Antoine district, and that's only the ones I found. There's an edge to his voice now, not bitterness. Frustration, yes, but also awe. He came expecting to check boxes. Instead, he discovered a whole society stitched between joists. He reaches into his bag and pulls out a sealed envelope. This, he says, is my report. Not the one I'll send, the real one. He doesn't open it, just tucks it deeper into the bag, between a half-eaten apple and a rolled-up drawing of a spoon, someone apparently considered valuable enough to sketch. As you shift to leave, he calls after you. If anyone asks, tell them this place has people in it. You nod. He nods back, once, tired but strangely proud. You slide down a wooden beam to a lower floor, past a vent where 2 children are playing a silent game with bottle caps. One drops and rolls to your foot. You pick it up, hand it back through the crack. No words exchanged. None needed. You realize now, the wall dwellers don't want to be counted, but they do want to be remembered. And sometimes, one weary man with a leaky inkwell and too many scrolls can do exactly that. There's a smell in this part of the wall. Not unpleasant. Faintly of candle wax, old soap, and something that might be rose water or glue. You follow it, sidestepping into a long, narrow corridor behind a townhouse stairwell. The space hums with warmth, not from a fire, but from the slow exhale of 2 people who've learned how to be quiet together. And then you hear it. A scratch. Just one, rhythmic, deliberate. Then a pause. Then another scratch. You've stumbled into a correspondence, one of the wall's slowest love stories. It begins here, behind the plaster, where 2 lovers communicate not by words but by code. Scratch, scratch, pause. A shared language tapped between heating vents, floorboards, and the thin, whispering skin of the building's inner frame. You press your ear to the wood. Tap, tap, swish. On the other side, someone shifts, someone responds. This is how they speak. Mainstream fact. In the 17th century, rigid class divisions and strict social structures made many relationships, especially cross-class, queer, or secret unions, nearly impossible. Forbidden romances often resorted to creativity, hidden letters, songs, symbols carved into walls. And in the case of wall dwellers, a romance conducted entirely through scratches, scuffs, and creaking floors. You follow the sound downward, and eventually into a small crawl space above the kitchen. There, curled beside a floor vent, lies a man, not young, but with the soft face of someone who has surrendered to the slow rhythm of hope. In one hand, a stick of charcoal. In the other, a folded scrap of paper. He doesn't see you. He's listening. After a moment, he scribbles something and pushes it through the vent using a sliver of bone. The note vanishes into the dark. You trace his gaze and find a string dangling in the beam above. A tin button is tied to the end, swinging slightly. A signal. Received. Fringe tidbit. A preserved beam from a demolished house in Rue Saint-Martin was found covered in a sequence of marks resembling Morse code, long before Morse ever existed. Some scholars believe it was a wall dweller's secret communication system. Others suggest it was a form of daily journal shared with someone on the other side of the wall. You crawl along the channel and eventually find the other half of this gentle equation, a woman, seated beside a vertical heating duct, eyes closed, fingers resting lightly on the paneling. She's mouthing words silently, maybe reciting what she read, or what she wishes she'd said. Beside her is a stack of paper scraps, folded, inked, smudged. You glance at one. The soup smelled like thyme today. Was it for me? Another reads, "My shoe is still under your floorboard. I hope it remembers me." There's a tenderness in this exchange that feels fragile, like a match held near silk. They've likely never touched, maybe never even seen each other clearly. One lives above the kitchen, the other near the chimney vent. Their worlds overlap only in vibration and timing, but their affection is real, solid, as much a part of the structure now as the beams that carry their messages. You shift, and the woman glances toward the vent, not in fear, just habit. Then she tugs a string, a different one. It rings a tiny bell behind the wall, and somewhere, several beams away, the man smiles. Historians still argue whether these vent courtships were rare or more common than anyone realized. Some dismiss them as romantic exaggerations. But oral histories passed down by servants, usually grandmothers by the time they told them, speak of whispers in the floor, of cousins who fell in love with a ghost, and of messages left where the walls touch, but the people never do. You pause beside a beam covered in small carvings, not names, images, a bowl, a spoon, a face with a single dimple. Maybe these were their versions of love letters. One drawing shows two figures holding hands across what appears to be a heating pipe. You smile. There's something deeply human about their method. Slow, intentional, hopeful. A love story written in silence and creaking floorboards. You crawl further and find another shared place, what must be a neutral drop zone. A small cloth bag hangs on a hook. Inside, dried petals, a broken ring, and a note. "If you ever leave a bootlace." I'll find it. You wonder if the other knows that note is here, if it's been read, if it's just waiting. You back away slowly, careful not to disturb anything. Behind you, the scratching resumes, soft, rhythmic, familiar, not frantic, just steady. This is what love looks like in the walls. No grand declarations, no fireworks, just charcoal and vents and the kind of patience only the hidden can perfect. You pass under another beam. Someone scratched a heart into it, a crude one, lopsided. But inside, two initials. One of them is an M. The other's been rubbed away. Doesn't matter. They know. Outside, the city is loud again, but in here, it's still. Two people breathe the same dusty air, wait for the next signal, and believe, utterly, that someone on the other side is listening. And for now, that's enough. You're not sure what wakes you, if you were even asleep to begin with. Maybe it's the sudden hush in the walls, the kind that settles like snow. Or maybe it's the sound of boots, heavy ones, the kind that don't belong inside homes, let alone inside walls. You inch forward toward the source of the disturbance. Your breath slows. The wall seems to hold its own, and then you see it. A crack of torchlight stabbing through a seam in the plaster, orange and flickering, sharp. It's an eviction, not the polite kind with notices and court seals. Number. This is the kind that comes with shouting, iron-tipped sticks, and the unmistakable urgency of a city cracking down on its own secrets. You're watching the midnight eviction of wall dwellers. Mainstream fact. While informal wall living was largely tolerated, or ignored, for much of the 1600s, There were occasional sweeps by property owners or local constables when complaints, scandals, or fires drew too much attention. These crackdowns were often swift and unceremonious, more about theater than justice. You peer through a knothole and see chaos. A group of laborers, likely hired muscle, not official guards, are pulling open panels with crowbars, poking long sticks into vents, shouting things like, "Anyone in there? Out! Now!" as though someone might politely walk out of the wainscoting. One yanks down a linen curtain. Another kicks over a tiny stool. Feathers explode from a pillow someone had lovingly stitched from scraps. They swirl into the air like ghosts. You crawl along the beam and spot the first evacuee, a boy no older than 10, stumbling barefoot from a chimney shaft, blinking like a startled cat. A man tries to grab him, but the boy slips and scampers under a table, vanishing into another gap. A chorus of curses follows him. Someone shouts, "There's another one in the rafters." Indeed, there is. A thin woman lowers herself through a hole in the ceiling like a spider descending on silk. She lands lightly, clutches a satchel to her chest, and walks, dignified, silent, through the open door. She doesn't look back. You find yourself in a parallel cavity above the hallway. From here, you see another man trying to pull his meager belongings through a beam gap, a ladle, a comb, and a sock stuffed with coins. He drops the ladle. It clatters. He flinches. Fringe tidbit. One recorded eviction from 1672 details a landlord discovering 7 people living inside his walls. The inventory included 4 tin plates, 2 cats, 1 bird cage, no bird, and a patchwork curtain inscribed with prayers. The landlord insisted on burning the items to cleanse the house. Neighbors complained about the smell for a week. You shift again, watching as a panel near the stairs gives way, revealing a small room, a woman, her daughter, and an older man with trembling hands. They don't resist. They simply look tired, as though this isn't their first time. The mother hands the child a scarf. The child tugs it tightly around her face and stares directly at the torch. "Don't look," the mother whispers, too late. Historians still argue whether these evictions were legal or vigilante. Most weren't officially documented, few were stopped, and those evicted rarely had anywhere else to go. The city didn't exactly leave a forwarding address for the recently dislodged. You crawl backward now, smoke stinging your eyes. Something's burning. A curtain, maybe. A pouch of herbs caught a stray ember. The scent is sharp and bitter. Cleansing, someone might say. But the walls smell like sorrow now. Another cry. A soft thud. Someone tried to hide in the crawl space beneath the stairs. They're pulled out, coughing, covered in lint and the quiet indignity of being found. No one cheers. The men grumble. One says, "Should have cleared this whole place years ago." Another mutters, "They'll just find a new wall." They always do. You crawl toward a quieter beam, away from the noise. You pass a pile of belongings hastily abandoned, a cloth doll, a spoon carved into a bird, and a scrap of paper that reads simply, "Stay low. Move fast. Leave the cat." You hear a meow behind you. Apparently, the cat had other ideas. Outside, a cart clatters to life. Someone's loading confiscated bundles onto it. The torchlight flickers against the buildings, making the windows blink like tired eyes. And then it's over. The men leave. The walls fall quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. You wait. You breathe. And slowly, the building exhales. Plaster settles. Boards creak. A soft rustle from above as someone, already, returns to a cavity left unsearched. You smile, despite everything. They weren't all caught. They never are. The city can't evict its own memory. You crawl forward and find one last chalk message scrawled onto a wall beam. You may chase us, but you built the walls. The air feels lighter now. You've wandered wall to wall through a city behind the city, climbed through chimney shafts, attic rafters, vent ducts, forgotten crawlways, and still, Paris hasn't run out of secrets. But something's different tonight. Something final. You're nearing the end. Not the end of the story. The end of this story. You emerge through a narrow panel that opens like a sigh into what feels like an empty room. Except it isn't. You recognize it, not by sight, but by silence. This place used to breathe. The dust is undisturbed. The air carries the stale warmth of spaces once filled with bodies, now left to settle. You walk slowly, hand trailing along the grain of a wooden beam polished by countless invisible palms. The wall dwellers are gone now, or almost gone. This is the echo of the lives they lived, a building with muscle memory. If you listen, really listen, you can still hear them. A creak where a floorboard used to warn of a heavy step, a whisper of breeze where a peephole let in moonlight, a faint scent of boiled lentils that somehow never quite leaves the wood. You're standing in the remnants of a world that didn't end so much as fade. Mainstream fact. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, Paris began to modernize. Slowly, unevenly, and often brutally. Fire codes were introduced, property laws were enforced, attics were sealed, chimneys reinforced, wall cavities filled with mortar or brick, not everywhere, but enough. The city began to close itself off, and with that, the wall dwellers began to vanish, not all at once, and not with fanfare, just gradually, like mist evaporating under morning sun. Fringe tidbit. A renovation in the 1720s uncovered a hidden space containing a single chair, a burnt candle, and a phrase scrawled on the wall. Still here, just quieter. You take a seat beside a sealed vent, now just a bulge in the plaster. Through it, you hear nothing. Not because no one's there, but because the wall has finally gone to sleep. You reach into your pocket and pull out a small token, something you picked up along the way. A spoon, a button, a note. It doesn't matter which. It's a piece of their world, and as you tuck it into the wall's edge, it feels right. Not as a monument. Just a whisper returned. You think of the boy with the soup vent, the laundress who dried clothes above someone's head, the priest-sealed hermit, the theater ghosts who mouthed lines no one asked them to, the wall lovers who never touched but always knew the other was listening. All still here. Not haunting, just echoing. Historians still argue how many lived this way, whether it was thousands or just a few hundred, whether they were brave, desperate, resourceful, or all three, whether we should remember them as survivors or as something more, citizens of a city that never admitted they were real. You lean back against the wall. It doesn't groan this time. It exhales, like it's grateful. On the beam above your head, someone has scratched one last message. We lived in the walls. You live in the world. Don't forget either of us. And you won't. Not now. Not ever. And now, you're still. The walls around you fade into softness. No more creaks, no whispers, no hurried feet or torchlight patrols. Just stillness, wrapping around you like warm linen left out in the sun. The city of Paris rests beneath your feet, tucked under moonlight. Somewhere out there, someone's baking tomorrow's bread. A cat leaps from rooftop to rooftop, unnoticed. And the walls are quiet again. You close your eyes. The world of the wall dwellers, strange and secret and endlessly inventive, folds gently into the corners of your mind. Their stories don't vanish. They settle, like dust, into the still places of your thoughts. You can revisit them anytime. Just knock once, twice. Pause. In the hush of this final moment, let your body soften. Loosen your jaw. Let your shoulders fall into the mattress like bricks into place. You are held quietly, just like they were. The wall behind your bed is just a wall. Or maybe not. Maybe somewhere in its bones, a memory lingers. Not a ghost, not a voice, just a warmth, just a presence, just a little reminder that stories live everywhere, even in places no one thinks to look. So rest now. Let your breath slow. You've traveled far tonight, not in miles, but in layers, through city walls, secret loves, gentle ruins. The city sleeps. And now, so do you.